This is the All About 80s Music podcast with John Micek and Steve Augello.
Hey, this is Steve Augello, and I'm here with John Micek.
How's it going, Steve?
It's going well, John. Bubbling up through what was mostly a male-dominated music scene in the 80s were the women. Performers, songwriters, instrumentalists, band members. Join us as we shed the spotlight on some of the decade's greatest ladies of the 80s. So, John, today we're recognizing some of the women that influenced the music we love in many different ways throughout the greatest decade. For you, who immediately comes to mind to kick off this conversation?
Steve, there are so many great female musicians in the 80s, so many great female vocalists. You think of Tina Turner, you think of Whitney Houston, you think of Stevie Nicks and Kate Bush, and so many people who were definitional to the decade. I'm going to start with Chrissie Hynde, who managed to bridge both the 70s and the 80s, getting her start with the Pretenders, who debuted in 1979 with Kid, their immortal song Brass in Pocket. Steve, so many songs from Chrissie Hynde: Talk of the Town, Message of Love, My City Was Gone, Back on the Chain Gang, Middle of the Road, 2,000 Miles, Don't Get Me Wrong. This woman is the quintessential 1980s rocker. She came out of the punk scene in London in 1977, was the girlfriend briefly of Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols, worked in Malcolm McLaren's famous sex shop in the Kings Road. Ohio, had a relationship with Ray Davies of the Kinks, Jim Kerr of Simple Minds. It felt like she was just there taking notes on everything the whole time. She came roaring out, Steve. A rare thing for the time, a female-fronted rock band. She could rock as hard and kick as much ass as any male musician of the decade. I saw Chrissie Hynde at Lilith Fair, must have been, 1997. Hynde came out and just ripped the roof off of what was then the E Center in Camden, New Jersey. Electrifying, an absolutely electrifying presence. And she's still at it. She's 70 plus. She's still at it to this day and sounds fantastic. Steve, the one thing I want to say about the Pretenders, too, is that, it's important to point out that Hynde and drummer Martin Chambers are the only two original members left standing. Unfortunately, that original amazing lineup of Hynde, Chambers, James Honeyman Scott on guitar, and Pete Farndon on bass burned brightly but briefly. Both of them lost to heroin overdose, a great scourge of the London scene of the 1980s. But she came rip-roaring back in 84 with Middle of the Road with Robbie McIntosh on guitar, just a stalwart of the English scene who went on to play with Paul McCartney, among others. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. She had Blair Cunningham, he of Haircut 100 fame, manning the drum kit at one point. So everyone has kind of rotated through the Pretenders, I feel like, at one point or another, but with Chrissie Hynde kind of as the band's main songwriter and North Star at all times.
I'm glad you read my mind because I wanted to give Martin Chambers a shout out. He always seemed like a constant presence in that band.
One of the great solid rock drummers. He goes there, he does his job, plays powerfully, which I can personally attest to.
Yeah.
With a lot of power.
All right. I'm going to start my list off with Janet Jackson, primarily because when my wife found out that we were doing Women of the 80s, and she noticed Janet Jackson wasn't on my initial list, she was extremely appalled. And her disgust with me was based around the fact that the Control album from 1986 was so big and influential. She told me it was the album that her and all her girlfriends listened to on their boomboxes and their Walkman for hours and hours. And this conversation with my wife, by the way, happened on a 3.5-hour car ride coming back to Pennsylvania from Long Island, during which she proceeded to shove all the Control album songs down my throat for about 30 minutes and gave me a bunch of facts and figures around it. So I wanted to share them with you here. So the Control album actually went on to become 10 times platinum, meaning it sold more than 10 million copies worldwide. The singles that were released off that album: What Have You Done For Me Lately, Nasty Boy, When I Think of You, which was actually her first #1 hit, Control, Let's Wait a While, and Pleasure Principle. These are all songs everyone knows and loves. This album actually made Janet the first female artist to have 5 top 5 hits from one album on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. The album also set a record for the longest continuous run of charting singles on the Hot 100 at 65 consecutive weeks. So my wife was right. It was a huge album in so many ways. Micek, you and I have talked about our take on Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis's production. I always felt like there was too much going on in that music, but I always respected their work. They really did a good job with this groundbreaking album, and they actually won a Grammy for Producer of the Year. And this led the way for the Rhythm Nation album that was released in '89 and all the subsequent albums that followed.
Yeah, Steve, I mean, it's kind of hard to understate how monstrously large this record was in 1986 as kind of the new wave pop of the middle 80s gave way to a more R&B focused direction on the charts going into 86 and into 87. It's hard to deny the success of this record. Control and Nasty What Have You Done For Me Lately. When I think of You as a particular favorite of mine off that record as well. From 2001, her All For You LP with the lead single from that album. Just undeniably catchy. We can all talk about her very controversial Super Bowl moment where Justin Timberlake did not get nearly enough grief in the estimation of quite a number of people. You know, she was a pop icon, remains a pop icon, and still making music even to this day.
So who's next on your list?
All right, I'm going to go with Alison Moyet, a great English soul singer, exploded onto the pop scene in the early 1980s as the vocalist in Yazoo. That's the band that Vince Clarke, formerly of Depeche Mode, founded after he abruptly exited that band for reasons still entirely unclear. Yaz made two absolutely bloody perfect albums, Upstairs at Eric's and their debut. You think of Only You and Connection and amazing techno pop singles, and they were in kind of in that vanguard of guy behind the keyboard with lead singer like Soft Cell or Blancmange. But in this case, it was this huge voiced vocalist from Essex in Alison Moyet. Just definitional to the era. She went on after Clarke went to form Erasure to release a brace of really great solo albums, including Alf, produced by Steve Jolie and Tony Swain, with its single Invisible, which is just this, gorgeous piece of chamber pop. And she is somebody, Moyet, I come back to again and again. I went through a Yaz phase, I have to admit, middle part of last year, and went down this complete YouTube rabbit hole and found her performing a few years ago at a Burberry fashion show. So she's there singing, and then I will tell the listeners this is worth digging up on the YouTubes. Her singing Only You, kind of accompanied by this chamber up kind of orchestra, while there are high fashion models walking all around her, and stars like Benedict Cumberbatch are on the side, and Anna Wintour from Vogue are looking on. I think it just goes to the fact that of how much those songs have just sort of insinuated their way into the culture, and despite the passage of 4 decades, they still sound as good as they ever have.
They have. And there are a lot of beautiful Alison Moyet performances on YouTube from the past 10, 15 years or so. I'm glad to see that she's still out there making music and singing, and she looks better than ever.
All right. Steve, your number 2.
Okay, so my number 2 is really my number 1 female artist of all time, and that is Olivia Newton-John. Now, Micek, you can argue that Olivia is primarily a 70s artist because a huge chunk of her work came out of that decade, including the smash movie Grease, which we could spend a whole entire show on by itself. But she made a double splash in the 80s, first with Xanadu, the movie, that came out in 1980, and the songs from that soundtrack that were just fantastic. And then in 1982, with their smash hit Physical, which infiltrated the pop charts and MTV in a huge way that year. The song became somewhat of a cultural phenomenon among girls and young women all around the country. And if you remember that video, her outfit and the signature headband that she was sporting became a fashion workout trend. It spawned an entire series of workout VHS tapes and shows that various women put out in the early 80s. And it was also the inspiration for tons of gym memberships happening that year. Everybody wanted to, let's get physical. That Physical album also featured a single called Make a Move on Me, which also was a huge hit that you remember. And that was an awesome song, although it wasn't the cultural phenomenon that Physical was. But Olivia, to this day, God rest her soul, remains my number 1 of all time. Love her.
I mean, what do you say? She's Olivia Newton-John, for God's sakes. The woman is iconic. Every single one of us sang along to Grease when we were little kids. Every single one of us watched the Physical video when we were little kids. I mean, I kind of feel like, Steve, that Olivia Newton-John, when she made that leap into the 80s, was part of that group of female vocalists that included Sheena Easton or Laura Branigan or that lady Charlene who had the Never Been to Me single and then promptly disappeared without a trace. Ballady with a big voice. Olivia Newton-John prior to that was known for being kind of squeaky clean in the 1970s. And then she blew that up with Grease and further blew it up with the Physical video, which was controversial for its time. It's important to point out. And she just remains sort of this iconic figure, a much beloved Australian citizen, sort of, part of the Australian entertainment firmament, battled breast cancer for those many years until it took us from her a little while back, and God rest her soul. But how do you say a single bad word about Olivia Newton-John? An incredible talent, and just seemed like I never knew her, but just seemed like a lovely, lovely person.
All right, who you got, Micek?
All right, so this is what I'm going to file this one under Everything Old is New again. Last summer, you might have seen this little TV show on Netflix called Stranger Things with this pop song called Running Up That Hill that all these kids loved, sung by the stalwart English vocalist Kate Bush, giving her hits in 3 decades, the 70s, the 80s, and now the aughts, or the 2020s. Kate Bush, you can just this really quixotic figure. She became successful very young, discovered by David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, made some amazing records, Running Up That Hill, Hounds of Love, Babushka, almost kind of prog rocky in a lot of ways, very, very quixotic stuff. You could kind of lump her in with Peter Gabriel as well. And she kind of disappeared from the scene, was content to kind of just do her thing, has periodically re-emerged ever since, just stratospheric last summer, Steve, with the reemergence of Running Up That Hill, Make a Deal with God. Every single time you turned on First Wave on Sirius XM, they were playing it again. It gave me a chance to introduce her music to my daughter, who would not have heard it otherwise. Just an amazing, amazing talent.
And I agree, she is definitely a well-respected visionary of the 80s, so it was nice to see her in your list.
All right, yours?
Micek, I tell you, I'm giving you a 2-for-1 deal with this one. It is the ladies of the Human League, Susan Ann Sully and Joanne Catherall. Now, you and I constantly talk about how much we dig and love Phil Oakey, but I think you would agree that having the ladies in the group really brought a nice balance to his famous smooth baritone voice. Susan Ann's vocal was an invaluable contribution to 1981's Don't You Want Me. It's such an important part of that historic song. And I love that Joanne later on got her hit in their 1986 single Human. And of course, both of them singing together in Love Action and Fascination and all those other songs. Just fantastic. Their dynamic duo made for a lot of great fun in the videos as well. And I want to dip into the 90s really quick just to mention their song Tell Me When, which I know you know. It was in the 90s, but it still had that classic Human League sound. There's a CD out there now on Spotify and the other streaming services where you can find remixes of that single. It features Utah Saints and a number of other producers. Just fantastic.
Yeah, Steve, it's important to mention these two women actually rescued the Human League from oblivion. Were it not for the audition of Joanne Catherall and then Suzanne Sully, now known as Susan Ann Sully, the fate of the Human League might have been entirely different. Listeners may or may not know that Phil Oakey was, the original Human League was an all-boys club with Ian Craig Marsh and Martin Ware and Philip Adrian Wright. And Martin Ware and Craig Marsh split off to form Heaven 17, leaving Phil and Adrian Wright, who was the band's slide projectionist, who had not a jot of musical talent. So Phil went out into the discos in Sheffield one night. They had a gig coming up. They needed to do something, by God. He stumbled across the then teenaged Joe Catherall and Suzanne Sully, asked them if they wanted to be in the band. They said yes. He got permission from their parents to bring them out on tour. You get breaks from school. True story. This is in the Synth Britannia documentary. And then they stayed with the band, and the rest, as they say, is pop history. So in this case, they were more than just backup singers. They literally saved the Human League from oblivion. Were it not for those two ladies, there would be no Don't You Want Me. There would be no Keep Feeling Fascination. It would have been a very, very different pop story.
Okay, it's your turn. Who do you got?
All right, for pick number 4, I'm going with Long Island, The Zone, and Steve, you should feel some hometown pride here. Miss Deborah Ann Gibson, Miss Only in My Dreams, Miss Shake Your Love Her Own Self, Miss Foolish Beat.
Sound like you're really into her, Micek.
You have your celebrity crushes, Augello. I got mine. She came roaring out with that first album, Out of the Blue, in 1987. What was cool for me about this was, as a young musician who is trying to write music, who's trying to make up his own songs, here was somebody our age, Steve, for the very first time, who was writing and playing on her own. That was huge.
Yes,
here was a 17-year-old girl. I was a 17-year-old. She could have been in high school with me. She could have been in high school with you. She was from Merrick, for God's sake.
I met her a few times, yeah.
Well, see, there you have it. And she was playing music and she was writing music. And there was something that was just really accessible and inspiring for me about that. Because if she could do it, then if Charlie Sexton could do it, then by God, I could do it too. Of course, there was the whole Tiffany rivalry thing. They're now best of friends, of course. But, it was the battle for the malls. Tiffany was out there performing in the malls. Debbie was playing halls. Just this burst of pop effervescence there in the summer of 1987 with some great songs.
It's funny, like we all have our guilty pleasures, but you seem pretty adamant about this one.
I will defend Debbie Gibson unto death.
James, I gotta tell you, you're on your own with this one, Micek. I just don't understand, with all the valuable street cred that you've built up over the years, this one's coming from, but hey.
This one, I will say this, somebody our own age, writing their own music, playing their own songs. I mean, how do you not doff, and making it big? How do you not doff your cap to that?
I hear you on that. You got to give her credit. She made it.
She's still doing it now. 52 years old. She's still doing it, man.
So I'm coming at you with someone that I feel like had to be mentioned, because you just can't glance over Madonna. And what can I say about Madonna that everyone already doesn't know? To me, she was really the original female pop icon superstar. She created the mold that set a high standard for so many female artists that followed, like Gwen Stefani, Katy Perry, and Lady Gaga. Before Madonna came along, I don't think there was really anyone previously doing what she did, singing, writing songs, involved in the production of the music, dancing, choreographing, and she always had a vision of what was coming next. So while Michael Jackson was doing all of that, representing for the guys, Madonna was on the other side, leading the charge for the gals. Just a super talented icon, visionary artist. A transformational figure, no doubt. There was pop before Madonna, and then there was pop after Madonna. That first record, the self-titled EP, where she was still that kind of downtown dancer figure who had hung out with Basquiat and played with the Breakfast Club, and it was kind of cutting edge and edgy. Every girl in our high school, Steve, after they saw Madonna, showed up for class the next day with kind of the crucifixes and the rubber bracelets and the mesh tops and t-shirts and all that stuff. Just a huge impact on fashion, a huge impact on music. A tremendous defender as well of the LGBTQ community. That cannot be understated. She opened up dialogues about femininity and sexuality that we probably would not have had were it not for Madonna. So as much as she's an important musical figure, she's, sort of a transcendent cultural figure as well. So Micek, who's next? All right, so this is where I rescue my street cred, apparently, with you after picking Debbie Gibson as my number 3 pick. I'm going with Stephanie Lynn Nicks, better known as Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac, a woman who had one foot planted in the 70s, one foot planted in the
80s. Again, what do you say about Stevie Nicks? She, like Madonna, is just such an iconic figure in rock and roll. With Fleetwood Mac singing Dreams and Rhiannon and Landslide. Rolling Stone called her the reigning queen of rock and roll at one point. It's hard to argue with that. She recorded with Tom Petty with Stop Dragging My Heart Around, Edge of 17, so many of her great solo records. Just recently on Amazon Prime was Daisy Jones and the Six, the video series based on the book by Taylor Jenkins Reid, borrows kind of liberally from that Fleetwood Mac love triangle mythology. I mean, it's kind of put her back out there in front of an entirely new generation of listeners. And I have to admit, Steve, this was one that I came around on, I think, later in life. My new wave and punk soul kind of rebelled against the idea of liking Fleetwood Mac, but much in the same way I find myself appreciatively listening to Pink Floyd these days. I've got a soft spot for Fleetwood Mac, and it's just hard to deny just the overabundance of talent in that band.
You had Stevie, you have Lindsay, you had Christine McVie. I mean, just three super talented songwriters in one band. Stevie is one of the true prolific songwriters and singers of our lifetime. I always thought it was cool, Micek, when in 2006, she joined Tom Petty's 40th anniversary tour as an honorary heartbreaker.
That's right.
I just did a bunch of dates with him singing background.
Yep.
How cool would it have been to be at one of those shows?
Oh, it'd be great.
You have this fantastic artist, an icon in the music world, and she can do whatever she wants, and she's like, I'm just going to sing backup for Tom Petty's band for their 40th anniversary tour. Just great. I thought it was awesome. She did sing a few songs, Stop Dragging My Heart Around, and a few others. Yeah,
I mean, seeing Tom Petty at any point would be amazing. Marnie bought me tickets for my 32nd birthday when we saw him at Hershey Park. One of the greatest rock and roll shows I've ever seen, ever. One of the tightest bands I've ever seen. Yeah. Just that unspoken communication on stage between Tom Petty and Mike Campbell and Ben Montench. The Brian Setzer trio opened up with this great set of rockabilly beforehand. But Steve, just trying to imagine throwing Stevie Nicks into that mix, it had to have been just extraordinary.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to set my last pick up by paraphrasing the last line of the Nails song, 88 lines for 44 women. Belinda Carlisle, here's a kiss. I chose you to end this list. You know that song?
I love that song.
So on one side, you had Susanna Hoffs, and on the other side, I felt, was Belinda Carlisle. Two parallel artists in many ways, both very talented ladies, leading all-female bands. Each had notable solo careers with numerous hits. I want to mention that similar to how Stevie Nicks was plucked out of Fleetwood Mac by Jimmy Iovine and set up with a path for a terrific solo career, it was nice to see Belinda also break out of her band in 1985 to go on and have a string of her own hits written by top songwriters and the best producers and musicians at her disposal. My favorite tune from her solo career, can you guess what it was?
Mad About You.
Absolutely. And do you know
what? Andy Taylor was on lead guitar.
That's right. Just a great song with Andy's presence on it. You remember that video where they were basically like sitting on patio furniture and he was just lounging out with that big guitar.
I think it was a Gresh. He was playing a Gresh.
Yeah, which was atypical for him. So it was nice to see him with sort of different guitar than he usually played, like his famous Washburn that we all have ingrained in our minds. She did such a fantastic job when she was heading the Go-Go's, and it was nice to see her have a great solo career. I feel her and Susanna are very similar artists.
All right, Steve, I am going to walk like an Egyptian on the way out of the pod this week with, yes, that's right, Susanna Lee Hoffs of the Bangles. I love this band for so many reasons. They started off the dawn of the 80s as one of the original Paisley Underground groups, playing 1960s girl group pop alongside the Dream Syndicate and Green on Red and Rain Parade. Really cutting edge American indie bands and holding their own among them. Going down to Liverpool, covering a song by the Soft Boys. And you had the Peterson sisters, Vicky Vicky on guitar and vocals, Debbie on drums and vocals, Michael Steele on bass and vocals, everyone just like a triple threat singing and playing in these gorgeous 4-part harmonies. And then all of a sudden we look up and it's 1985 and it's a different light, and they are this high sheen pop group playing a Prince cover in Manic Monday, and that record just went mega with Walk Like an Egyptian and Walking Down Your Street. And that led to the next Bangles record with Eternal Flame on it and In My Room. And, their creative tensions, the old story of creative tensions boiling over in the band. A little bit too much of the spotlight shown on Susanna Hoffs to the detriment of the rest of the band. And the Bangles kind of sadly fell apart and wouldn't play together for about 10 or so years. They've since regrouped and play together regularly. Susanna Hoffs has released some really great solo records, most recently one last year. She did 2 albums of covers with Matthew Sweet. She's got her first book coming out. She's absolutely adorable on Instagram. She's just so much fun to follow. And, just a really talented vocalist, a really talented singer-songwriter. And again, one of those kind of like iconic figures of the 80s that everyone kind of associates with the decade.
I want to mention that what I loved about the Bangles is that they had their hit songs, right? Walk Like an Egyptian, which was huge, Eternal Flame. If She Knew What She Wants, which was a later tune that never really got...
written by the great Jules Shear, one of the great underappreciated songwriters of the 1980s.
Right. And In Your Room. So they had great songs on their own, but the covers that they did, they really made their own.
Hazy Shade of Winter, just amazing.
Right. We were at the age where you would hear them do Hazy Shade of Winter, and you didn't know it was a Simon & Garfunkel song until like the DJ said it. It was like, right. Oh, they totally remade that song into their own version of it, totally different from the original, and it fits so well with the rest of their repertoire. And of course, Manic Monday, which Prince wrote for them.
And 30-something years later, everyone says they're having a Manic Monday.
It's always funny to hear that song on a Monday, but they play it all throughout the week on the pop stations still. So it's kind of funny when you hear it on a Thursday. It's like, oh yeah, it's a great song anyway.
Just another Manic Thursday. It doesn't roll off the tongue in quite the same way. All right, that's all the time we have for this week. It's been a blast running down these lists of the great ladies of the 1980s. I'm John. Like, share, subscribe, share your comments in the comments section below, and pick us up everywhere you can get podcasts.
And until next time, keep it cool, keep it awesome, and keep it totally rad.